Hi, Tim.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Very good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Tim Wu, well known for a number of things. You're a professor of law at Columbia. You've written a number of books, The Attention Merchants, The Master Switch. We're going to talk about a book you've just written. And you ran for lieutenant governor of New York. Maybe we'll have time to talk about that. But you are perhaps best known as the person who coined the term, a term that even people who don't understand have heard, the term net neutrality.
Yep.
That's you.
Everyone does something, I guess.
Yeah, but not everyone already knows what the first sentence of their obituary will read, Tim.
Oh, good.
Unless you go on to do even greater things, which there's time for. You're young.
That's true. You think about Thomas Jefferson's grave. He wrote those. What's the three things he wrote? I can't remember, but
no idea.
President of the United States, but like founder of University of Virginia. Writer of the Declaration of Independence. But he left off President of the United States because that was like a triviality to him or something.
Well, see, if he had coined the term net neutrality, he would have put that in, also above president, because that would have shown true prescience. So anyway, this book of yours we're going to talk about, The Curse of Bigness, Antitrust in the New Gilded Age. Now, it doesn't look exactly like this. This looks like a spiral notebook.
Yeah.
But by the time we actually run this conversation, the book itself will be available. And the jacket, the cover will look more or less like that.
Yep.
And in it, you argue that we should be much more vigorous in applying antitrust law to the current corporate landscape. You advocate even breaking up some companies such as Facebook, which we'll talk about. And you argue that we would be, if we really properly understood the kind of central thrust of the legislative and judicial history of the concept of antitrust in America, we would be more inclined to enforce antitrust law vigorously. Is that right? That if we really understood the whole kind of heritage, we would be more vigilant on this front. Is that right?
I think that's exactly right. I think that if we properly understood it, as you suggest, to recover lost history, we think of antitrust as having much broader goals, having a lot to do with political questions, equality, labor conditions. Just a lot of things that we care about right now can be linked to a problem of overconcentration.
Okay. So let's, and there's a lot, I mean, the other thing is that just like the landscape has changed so much, there's whole new kinds of reasons to think about breaking companies up. Like, I mean, the day may come when, I have this intelligent assistant that's so intelligent, right? It's like AI. It's telling me what to read. It's doing my calendar. And like, do we want that to be in the hands of one company? So questions like that are raised. We'll get to those. Before we get into the central thrust of your book, why don't we take just the Facebook example? Sure. Because I think people may say, like, how would you break up Facebook? Well, for starters, they own some other things like WhatsApp, Instagram. So what would you have Facebook do?
So I think in the 2010s, the government made a few big mistakes when it came to merger review. That is, deciding whether a firm could buy another firm. Facebook faced serious competitors in Instagram and WhatsApp, firms that could, pretty obviously make them yesterday's news, a little like they did to MySpace.
Yeah. And
the government just let them buy it. In fact, I think on last count, Facebook has bought 67 firms or something without any conditions or oversight. There's oversight, but no one's ever stopped them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think those acquisitions were illegal. I think they were they basically bought off their most competitive threats, and the law is supposed to prevent that. So I would undo the mergers. So Instagram would become its own company, WhatsApp would become its own company, and ideally they'd be competing for maybe even along privacy grounds, like, hey, we're not going to be spying on you. Maybe one of them could say, hey, we're going to be more resistant to Russian efforts to overthrow the elections. Maybe on the number of ads they show you. You know, they could actually compete. Right now, they don't really compete. They don't, obviously they're owned by the same people, so they don't threaten each other.
Okay. And it's a pretty straightforward solution. I mean, I'm sure it's more complicated to break up a company than you might imagine, but they were once discrete parts, right? And it's happened. I mean, we broke up AT&T.
Yeah, AT&T is a lot more complicated. AT&T was a massively integrated company. These are separate companies. They have separate, I think they have separate offices. But anyway, that doesn't matter. And I think it's very doable and wouldn't even be that challenging under the legal standards. So I don't know what we're waiting for. Maybe I'll put it that way. Yeah,
and I guess this has to do with part of what you say, I think, is the misunderstanding of what antitrust law is supposed to be about in this country, is the difference between kind of your criterion being like demonstrating some kind of harm to the consumer, which actually I think I might be able to do in Facebook, but in the case of Facebook, but in any event, you're saying that the proper standard should be just ensuring robust competition, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think what you're referring to is the idea that I think antitrust has just become too fixated on prices, and whether you can see price effects is a very economic concept. So when Facebook bought Instagram, everyone in the business world knew they were buying their most dangerous competitor. But inside the antitrust agencies, I was working there.
Were you really? You were in the Justice Department then?
Federal Trade Commission.
The FCC, sorry, okay.
Yeah. No,
or FTC, right.
The outlook at that time was, well, they're giving away products for free, so we're not sure how this is going to raise the prices anyone pays, so essentially no problem. And I think that there's been a real, sort of hyper-technocratic side to antitrust, somewhat well-intentioned, very smart people involved, but they've gotten completely fixated on, sophisticated economic tools and trying to prove, and so they let a lot of big things go. And so this is why I'm calling for a big, broad revival. Some of it is people who just want to get rid of the laws. I shouldn't, count them out. There's been a lot of, obviously, big business does not like antitrust. So they'd be happy if it's essentially retreats to nothing.
Mm. And the idea of focusing on price in particular is crazy in a number of realms where the service is basically free. That's not how you would compare the performance of two companies, right? And Facebook is an example of that.
Well, Facebook charges advertisers.
Oh, I see. Well, yeah, but they're not, I guess they are consumers of a sort. They're not the main consumers of Facebook.
Well, now you're starting to see where the law enforcement runs into problems. They're like, well, they have advertisers, and I guess they're selling to them in what's called a two-sided market. But this is getting very complicated. We don't know how to deal with it. Let them do what they want. See, that's the problem, is that in a lot of areas where they haven't been able to measure exactly what's going on, the default, and I can see why people in government are often very cautious and afraid, but the problem is we've just allowed sort of a Standard Oil-like consolidation of tech. It's not Facebook alone. I think Amazon actually, has bought somewhere in the 97 other companies, and the champion is Google, which is, I think, 237 companies, a couple challenged.
Well, that's why they finally had to declare themselves a larger company that encompasses Google. They even gave it a whole new name to signify how far-flung they become, Alphabet.
Yeah, well, let me just give one example on Google. I don't really know why we allowed Google to buy Waze, the other major online map company.
It's amazing. Yeah, when you think about it, I had forgotten they own them, and that happens too. A lot of people probably don't know Facebook owns Instagram.
Yeah, but we let it happen. There was, I guess, 3 competitors. Apple has Apple Maps, but they're not that great, but they're out there. Waze, Google. And, it takes a little more understanding of these markets. They're complicated. So the reason I think Google thought Waze was a competitive threat was that people might use Waze to become a platform for competing with the Google paradigm. So, a lot of people start with maps, right? Oh, I'm looking for a barbershop, or I could probably use a haircut. I'm looking for a doctor or something like that. So they go to maps first. And so I think Google thought, well, people are going to start going to Waze or Google. And then if you had a bunch of people piggybacking on top of Waze, maybe Yelp and maybe, I don't know who else. And then they have this alternative ecosystem. Well, that's a threat. So they bought Waze, got rid of the threat. And the agencies just, passed on it, don't understand it. And so we've allowed, like I said, this kind of consolidation of tech.
Yeah. And you're saying that actually, I mean, even into the 1990s, there was more vigilance on this front, right? I mean, this kind of complete relinquishing of authority almost is a pretty recent thing.
Yeah, one of the things I talk about in the book is the big case tradition. I think there was a long-standing tradition associated with Theodore Roosevelt to begin with, where the Justice Department would target the biggest monopolies if they'd been there for a long time and try and break them up. Mm-hmm. And the last gasp of that was in the 90s with Microsoft. The idea that Microsoft had monopolized operating systems and was trying to destroy Netscape to control the browser, to control the web. That was the end of it. I think things have faded a lot since the 90s, and even going back to the 90s would be a step forward.
And so that's just, I mean, yeah, in the 90s they took on Microsoft in a fairly serious way. But what was the change just due to ideology? I mean, Republicans came in and they don't like corporate oversight.
I think it's kind of that relentless glacial pressure of commerce being very opposed to the antitrust laws, pushing very hard for judges, especially the Republican Party, that were not favorable to antitrust against business. Against favorable to business against antitrust, and staff passing on and new staff coming. Just a sort of ideological drift in favor of just this very price-centered law that is really only concerned with price-fixing cartels. And, like I say in the book, I think it has a much broader social political role. At some level, it's part of the constitutional order. It's concerned with private power. And maybe we can get to that.
Well, yeah. Well, what are some of the possibly like non-obvious connections you see between current problems and like social problems, economic problems, and antitrust regulation?
Okay. Well, where should I start? So maybe I'll start with the slightly more obvious ones. I think most people can agree that having three major airlines has not been great for service, prices, or anything. It's very easy for them to agree, all right, let's have baggage fees at $50 and change fees at $200. And, they have some resistance from Southwest, but it's a little different when they have 5 or 7 competitors. I think pharmaceutical industry is consolidated and faces very little limits in its ability to raise prices by thousands of percentage and do these schemes where they everyone's seen they jack the prices on all kinds of random drugs through mergers, frankly, that don't get reviewed. Mm-hmm. So what they usually do is they take a drug and they transfer it to some smaller company. The smaller company jacks the price by 7,000% or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's all gone completely unreviewed. And obviously, I don't think people are happy about it. Those are more obvious. I think the more subtle effects come in terms of a contribution to this problem of economic inequality, which everybody is concerned with. And why is that? Well, the more concentrated industries get, and we're in an age, I think, of unprecedented, other than the first Gilded Age, unprecedented level of concentration among industries. There is, first of all, an ability to keep wages stagnant. The wages haven't gone up since the 1980s, as you probably know.
Right. And
second of all, to sort of concentrate the wealth among shareholders and management, and actually certain classes of professional bankers and lawyers in particular. And so, it's not the only cause of inequality, I think. I think trade and other things have to do with it. But I think industrial concentration is a major cause. This is one thing that Obama White House started to get into right at the very end when I was there for a brief period, was trying to really get at this nut of maybe we've just let the economy get out of control in terms of concentration. And that's an antitrust failure. Mm-hmm. Can I just point out one last one?
Sure.
There is a tenor in antitrust thinking, which has always thought that a more competitive economy is more compatible with democracy than a highly concentrated economy. And this is based on the experience of fascism. One of the post-war theories was that Hitler and Mussolini had benefited from these highly concentrated, even though they pretended to be anti-big business, they worked with them, and that the consolidation of industry had aided to this and aided the rise of sort of strongman leaders. And so that's something else, I think, especially around the world. You look at Brazil or Hungary. I'm not going to talk about at home, but you have a lot.
And is that just because it's easier for the leader to intimidate like a few big players than many, and get them to like march in step and pressure them into issuing these rosy press releases about how much, they've benefited from the policies of the administration?
I think the story goes a little bit like this, which is that you have concentration itself, which itself leads to inequality, a lot of suffering, which provides the conditions for kind of a strong, extreme leader to promise a return to greatness, who's going to tame big business, cramp down on enemies and so forth. And then when he actually comes to power, to work hand in hand with the business, both of them interested in maximizing their power. That is sort of the story of the German and Italian examples. And I think, I'm not going to go all the way and say we're exactly in that situation, but we are in an era of high global concentration and national concentration and a return to extremist leadership around the world. And so that's possibly linked as well.
Okay. And can you draw out a little more the connection between kind of market concentration and low wages? Because, some people might think, you've still got somewhere else you can go so long as there's a few companies you could work for. And also maybe you have skills such that you could do a different kind of job at a wholly different kind of company or whatever. How does it play out?
Right. So it has to do with the idea that wage increases depend on competition for workers. So if you imagine a town in the United States that has several hospitals that are competing, and they want to hire the best nurses, let's say, or they want to hire nurses at all, they might have to offer them higher wages. If you have a merger where they all consolidate to one hospital, why would they ever offer higher wages ever? They have no pressure to do so, unless you think there's a national market, people moving. But still, given that most people don't move most of the time, if you have a geographical monopoly, you never have to offer higher wages. And I think that's been an experience in a lot of industries. Think airlines, for example. Why do they have to offer flight attendants any more money? Because they can agree on salaries without explicitly.
You mean there's implicit collusion among the airlines?
Yes. I think there's been a lot of implicit collusion on wages in a whole number of industries. Actually, you saw it made explicit in the tech industry, where the people in tech were like, okay, trading emails saying don't raise anybody's wages. We don't want engineers to make too much money.
Well, they even had non-poaching agreements, didn't they? Like, we're not going to hire your workers and you won't hire ours. That kind of cuts down on the leverage of workers who are looking for high wages.
Yeah. We're as workers, we're producers, right? And we're selling something. And if there's tacit collusion among the buyers, then, and this is something antitrust law has not been able to really get its hands around at all. Supposedly it's illegal, but it happens all the time. And I think many people believe it's one of the contributors to wage stagnation.
Okay. So the idea is the smaller the number of companies that dominate, the easier it is to kind of do implicit collusion, sometimes explicit but covert, as it was in the cases you're citing. And I guess this is especially a big problem when the skills of the worker are really well suited to a particular thing. Like, for example, if you run a cash register, it may not be a huge problem that CVS is the only drugstore in your town, because there's a lot of places that have cash registers. But whenever you get like very industry specific skills, concentration's a problem.
That's why I brought the nurse example.
Yeah.
In the town with one hospital.
Yeah.
What are you going to do, right?
Mm.
You could retrain and become something, but a nurse has already put years into training. Mm. Now, a doctor would have a little more bargaining leverage, right? But also, even a doctor will be affected in that situation. But they usually have more money. They can move. Often, they're actually not employees, but independent.
Exactly, they're their own. They're subcontractors, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. The CVS thing is funny. It seems they've been pretty casual about letting these chains grow and merge. I mean, you lived in DC. I don't know if you ever lived there in the era of People's Drug Store, but that got swallowed. And it's weird because there's a couple of things. I mean, one is I'm curious just about this dynamic where CVS makes basically clones of all these kinds of products, like Gillette razor blades, and they just make exact copies. They even say on the label, this is an exact copy. and they name the brand that this is just like, but it's cheaper than that. Is that like an issue for you? I mean, it seems to kind of benefit the consumer. It seems a little unfair in that they're piggybacking on the marketing costs of like making this product famous. But is that an issue for you?
That's something antitrust law really struggles with. Amazon's another good example. Amazon is taking over the battery market right now, for instance.
Really?
Yeah. Well, if you go on Amazon, type batteries, you have to go way down before you get Duracell. It's like Amazon's own batteries are its favorite batteries. That is a challenging issue because sometimes it's cheaper.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, it usually is.
Right. So it depends on, but I think, if you let it go too far, it really depends on whether you're talking about a company with monopoly power or not. But I think overall, economists over the last 20 years have tended to disregard those concerns. They have a special word for them, intra-platform issues, they call them. And they say, well, as long as there's competition between CVS and someone else, then we don't have to worry about these problems. We don't care about those businesses. And why should we care if CVS makes, why do we care if CVS makes razors and if Gillette goes out of business? That's kind of in the line, right? But I think if you take it too far and you start having platform monopolists and you start having a world where, it's suicide to start any new company,
right?
You have a real problem of stagnation. You just have essentially, imagine some future where Amazon's the only place everyone buys anything.
Right.
And, if you have anything successful, Amazon started making it itself. Well, what's the point of starting a business? And entrepreneurship.
Yeah, I mean, you see, I guess in Silicon Valley, increasingly, the point of starting a business is to get bought by some huge thing, right? That's one of the main payoff scenarios now.
Yeah, and I think that's very different than the American tradition. It's not like Bell or General Electric or any of these, or Hewlett Packard or Google or Apple. They didn't start with like, oh my God, think about Apple. It wasn't like these guys said, all right, all we need to do is get bought by IBM, and then we got it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is, it's a real change in the innovation culture of the United States, where the goal, it seems, of every person right now is how do I get myself a paycheck? Let alone something else, is which one upon a time people would just build things because they wanted to.
Yeah.
They'd invent them and then, give them to the public, basically. I mean, the original internet protocols were, the guys didn't become billionaires. They became famous, but they didn't cash out somehow. They just said, okay, here's this thing we invented. That's totally gone.
Well, some of them were not in the private sector. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee basically invented the World Wide Web, and he's a little appalled at what it's become because he didn't imagine it becoming this kind of crassly commercial thing, but that's life. So let's talk, before we get into more contemporary antitrust cases, let's go back a little further in history. So a big kind of turning point for you, I guess, is like Robert Bork. I mean, he's most famous, of course, for failing to be confirmed for the Supreme Court. And in the Republican telling of events, he was, what the Democrats did to him was the first big shot fired in the warfare that led us to where we are now, where the Supreme Court appointments are just crassly, openly political things, and everything is fair. But leaving that aside, lesser known is that he was a huge figure in antitrust. He wrote a book, I think, called The Antitrust Paradox, and he became very influential in a way that you're not enthusiastic about, right?
Yeah, well, I think he stood for the trends that we're talking about today. I think that the influence of Bork's thinking has basically enfeebled the antitrust law. In some ways, it had a very noble sounding idea, which is we need to be more rigorous. We need to pay attention to the welfare of consumers. But in practice, it has ended up putting a straitjacket on enforcers. And that's why I'm calling for revival, as I think the Borkian influence just went way too far.
And didn't he kind of argue in a highly theoretical way that, okay, if we do focus on consumer harm, in particular prices, if you look at this, kind of theoretically, it's really not all that easy for even a big company to have this dominant price power over pricing, right? I mean, I actually remember, Mike Kinsley, right?
Yeah.
When he was editor of the New Republican, I was working there. He was very taken by, Mike, who's, by the way, I think the greatest editor of his generation and is a genius, but he's very taken by kind of sharp analytical arguments that may be highly theoretical. And he was very persuaded. I mean, he would go around saying, now read your Bork. Like if I said, like, let's break up all the companies, you know. Right. And I guess Bork did do a good job of arguing that at least making people think twice about how easy it's going to be for companies to actually have the kind of power we worry about. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So Bork, very powerful advocate, incredibly talented lawyer. Antitrust paradox is a classic. And like I said, it made as an important content very rigorous. What it pointed out is that antitrust was a big collection of goals. It didn't have one goal. And he said, Bork, that this part is where he has been discredited. But he went back and said, oh, Congress only ever cared about prices or about consumer welfare, you know, and that's all they cared about.
Going back to the Sherman Antitrust Act?
Yeah, going back to Sherman Antitrust Act in the 1890, in the debates leading up to the Act in 1890, all that Congress cared about was that. Now, it wasn't true, and I don't think anyone now looking back at it thinks that Bork was right. But he said that was his theory. And, you know, he had this very different picture of the monopolist, which you kind of referred to. He was more like a gentle giant, constantly afraid of being competed with. You know, Microsoft put some of this up in its defense. So did AT&T. You know, we only do things for good reasons, and if we don't, we get punished in the market. I don't think economists think that that's right anymore, but it was very persuasive and very counterintuitive, which may be why Kinsey liked it so much in the 80s. Say, hey, these guys are actually good guys. But I think it went whatever the merits were, it went way too far to the point where basically antitrust has forgotten about monopoly as a problem.
Yeah.
You know, it's somehow... in fact, there's a Supreme Court opinion where Justice Scalia starts talking about how great monopoly is because it encourages people to do things.
Right.
And whatever Congress said in 1890 when they were trying to, you know, pass the anti-monopoly laws, they weren't saying these guys were great. In fact, they compared monopoly to slavery. They were like, you know, this is destroying our country, what it stands for. These guys are more powerful than government. You know, they were clearly concerned about the political influence of big companies over government. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this sort of whitewash friendly version of big business that's just our pal is hard to square with that original intent.
So Bork persuaded people of two things, basically that the proper focus of antitrust law is on consumer harm with maybe particular emphasis on prices. And secondly, he persuaded them that actually when you look at it, it's not that easy for big companies to do much consumer harm.
That's what he said. Yeah, that's basically it. He had more, but you know, this is not an antitrust class.
Yeah. So, and you alluded to Microsoft. I mean, a whole nother thing is that since Bork, the nature of an information economy, a digital economy, is just so different in fundamental ways. I mean, I remember the Microsoft antitrust case in the 90s. One thing I was kind of hoping someone would point out, and maybe they did in the course of all the op-eds and in the course of all the arguing in court, was, you know, it just seems kind of straightforward to me. I mean, the thing about software, I mean, like if you're making a car, certain amount of money goes into the design, the engineering, but then also a lot goes into making each copy of the car, right? That's a big cost. Whereas with software, of course, it's pretty much all in the design and engineering. Once you've done that, making a new copy costs basically nothing. So the cost to Microsoft of making a copy of Windows or of the Office suite is the cost of design divided by like the number of copies sold. That's like, wait, am I doing this right? Anyway,
I mean, the marginal cost is almost zero.
Well, the marginal cost is zero, but my point is this: if my point is this, I may have said it wrong, but Microsoft had like what 95% of the computer share, and Apple had like 5% or something like that.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, Microsoft could say, well, you know, our operating system costs no more than theirs, so how could we be doing anything wrong? But you point out that, wait a second, you are selling so many more than them, and your costs, your total production costs, are the same as theirs because it's all in the design. So if you faced true competition, you would sell each unit at a fraction of what Apple is charging, right?
Yes, that's right.
But so I didn't hear anybody say that, but it's an example of how the old-fashioned focus on price just doesn't make sense anymore, right? And it's also an example of how so-called economies of scale, which I know you're kind of skeptical of in some contexts, in an information economy, they like go into hyperwarp, right? I mean,
I'm not skeptical of them. I'm skeptical when it comes to restaurants.
Okay, in some contexts.
Domino's Pizza is any better than local pizza. But no, absolutely. I mean, I think it are in hyperdrive for all the reasons you suggested. And price gets you into all kinds of, it's a bad guide. I think antitrust suffers from price fixation. The Facebook, Instagram was a good example of that. I already discussed it. Google Waze, even Google YouTube. It's just, no one had any sense. Well, everything's being given away for free. Actually, what's going on here is people are competing for attention. They can't figure that out at all. And as you said, all the products, the marginal cost of them is zero.
Mm-hmm.
And so the economics are just completely different than Standard Oil or Alcoa aluminum monopoly or anything else. And I'm not saying the economists, I mean, they're very talented economists working at these government agencies, but they're also risk adverse. The agencies, when they don't understand something, just aren't good at doing things. And they're also afraid the courts are even worse. And so that's why we need antitrust revival.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about like a particularly challenging problem, which is like the coming AI. Now, I wrote a piece in Wired, I don't know, about 5 months ago saying, I think, I mean, I don't really know how to handle it. What I proposed, and again, the scenario is like, already, I mean, Google News is looking at what I've clicked on and tailoring my menu of news stories to that. Right. There are these scenarios where, well, I mean, anyway, I don't have to really elaborate to get people to envision a moment when they're taking so many cues from a single AI. And my view is that it's going to make sense for people to have a single AI, right? The consumer is going to tend to say, they're not going to have like Alexa for this and Google Assistant for that. It's going to make sense to have one. And you can imagine the dynamics of the market producing one, maybe two big remaining players. It just seems to me that given that the AI will have growing power over what we think,
right?
You want robust competition.
Yes.
But how do you get that? Do you have thoughts about what you do?
I think it puts us back in the face of a classic dilemma, which is, what do you do about something that looks like it's maybe a natural monopoly? So I don't know if you're right or not, that it is in fact going to converge on one. In a lot of areas, it's hard to predict whether something's going to become a monopoly or not. You might think, I don't know, let's say light beer. To me, they all kind of taste similar, but there's, at least several types of light beer. In fact, if you start adding craft beers, there's tons of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't sort of give up immediately and say, well, there's going to necessarily be one, therefore we need to think that way. But if you're hanging out, if it's like 10 years later and it's clear, I don't know who wins. Let's say Amazon wins. So Alexa is everything. Everyone relies on Alexa. And there's no hope of inducing competition. I mean, one thing you could try breaking them all up. That's challenging, I think, when you have a standard thing. The other is then you start talking about, well, what about public utility law? Then you say goodbye to antitrust. And you say, maybe we need to just make sure they behave themselves. Start saying, here's an entity. I mean, it comes back to me. Everything comes back to power. You're talking about an entity which potentially has enormous power over all of us because it controls what we see, answers our questions. It's kind of a dream for marketing. I mean, the point of advertising is to try to influence you. But as opposed to advertising, you can just suggest, well, hey, here's a nice battery you might want, which is, that's better than advertising. And so,
sure.
Not to speak of electioneering, if you really did have the one AI, I'm sure this is one of the scenarios you're thinking about. It's not really hard with adjustments at the margins to think you could throw elections. If you really had everyone on one AI and they use it all the time, or you could at least influence elections. So then you start talking about a completely different story, which is like some kind of public utility or oversight. But I wouldn't give up that quickly. I'd still try to force there to be competition, maybe, hoping for 4 competitors.
Well, that's what my view is, that the goal should be They should just say, we need to always give consumers the choice of at least several AIs. So let's start now doing things to ensure that no single company ever gets more than 40% of market share or something. But is there any precedent for approaching it that way?
Yeah, sure. Look at cell phones, mobile. We look at that market, and the government has done a lot to try to prevent that becoming less than 4.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the same factors there, right? Like, why do you have 4 sets of cell towers? Why do you have 4 sets of phones and all these things? And, that could easily become one company. If they had their druthers, they'd probably be 2 companies. They keep trying to merge, actually. And hopefully this government stops them.
Right.
They're trying to merge down to 3 again. So you kind of and you say, all right, here and no further, 4 or whatever. And you have to police that line.
Now, historically, there were cases where we said, okay, maybe it's kind of a natural monopoly. So we'll grant that, but the government will regulate it. That's what AT&T kind of was, right? And it was a similar kind of argument. It's like, why build 4 of everything? Same with railroads. Why build 4 parallel railroad tracks and so on? Sometimes we've been persuaded that was an argument for monopoly. We made it a natural one. But I guess 2 things. There are some areas where you definitely don't want the government stepping in and being AI and elections is a perfect example, right? You don't want the government stepping in and saying, well, there's only one Facebook, all the other social networks are dead, so we will decide what news goes on. You don't want that. But you don't even think AT&T worked well, which in principle would have been more amenable to a happy outcome from government regulation, right?
I think AT&T showed a lot of the dangers that we're talking about. You had one giant monopolist, and they essentially sat on they turned the entire telecom sector into something very stagnant. But they also ran into some of the dangers you talked about. They ended up very, very close to government, so close they helped government. They ran the nuclear laboratories. They helped spy on people. We still don't know how much AT&T spied on people during the whole Cold War period.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So they were just a willing government tool the whole time?
I don't think we fully know.
Mm-hmm.
We do know in the Bush era how much spying AT&T did, and it was a lot. Because they after 9/11 they wanted to reinvigorate all the spying efforts. But I don't know how much was going on in the 60s or 50s enabled by AT&T. I don't think maybe no one will ever know. So yeah, I think and this goes back to my concerns about fascist forms of government. I mean, maybe that's a little extreme, but when you think of, as you said, like the AI monopolist in a partnership with government, and then I've been in government, so I know how it works. Facebook, let's say let's say it's Facebook. Facebook will come in government and be like, hey, we know you have a problem with missing children. Why don't we help you find them? And no politician's going to say, yeah, I'm against finding missing children. And then, how about locating known terrorists? Okay, well, how about locating pedophiles? Great. So next thing you know, like, government is in partnership with Facebook, and we're running all these things together. So when you're depending on them to do your work for you, then you never want to break them up because, like, wait a second, these are the guys who are finding the missing children. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And you get these dangerous partnerships. That's what I think is dangerous about monopoly. Is that partnership can lead in some very scary directions.
Yeah, well, and in the whole privacy realm, I mean, both that part of it, like, is it the government that's snooping on me, and the part where it's like, does Google know too much about me? It's just the more players there are, the more. Would you say the models on offer now are significantly different? I mean, supposedly, like, Apple is saying, we're going to get less of your information than Google has. That's part of our brand. You have to worry less about our invasiveness. Microsoft kind of says the same, but they're not enough of a player in, maybe for it to matter as much. But do you think there is right now on offer significant differences in the amount of, like, privacy invasion you're buying into?
Yes, in some markets, Apple being the example that you're talking about. Also, a little bit WhatsApp, at least in the old days, Snapchat. The big dividing line, this gets to my second book, Attention Merchants, depends on the business model. So Apple doesn't depend on accumulating massive amounts of your data for their money. They depend on you and handing over cash because you like their products.
Mm-hmm.
Facebook, as they say, you're the product, right? So they're only somewhat working for you. They're also working, I don't mean to sound like, I don't know what you'd say, conspiracy theorists, but everyone knows that basically they see you as a product to sell to advertisers. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, they need to know a lot about you. And so their whole business model drives them, has constantly driven them towards collecting more and more and more information and then selling it to whoever wants it, which has led to all these problems with Russia and data breaches and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they have a very ethically dangerous business model. There is some choice. I mean, I think Apple's there, but Apple doesn't have a social network or a search engine.
I mean, that reminds me, the other thing is allowing huge market dominance puts you at the whims of just kind of the randomness of what kind of person it winds up being running the company. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg's history in college, does not inspire confidence, right? In his, I mean, beginning with that thing, he started the hot or not thing where he subjects his fellow students to ritual humiliation if they're unattractive. And then continuing to how he, dealt with that potential rival in college, the Winklevoss, what are they? The Winklevoss brothers?
Yeah.
So it's and you've seen throughout Facebook's history, it seemed to me, you've seen that, maybe you disagree, that the default mode is complete disregard for my concerns as a human being, right? So it's we're going to try this, and then if they just start screaming, we'll apologize.
Right. Yeah, just say sorry very sincerely. We're really sorry.
Whereas I don't think, Google is pretty aggressive, and they do some creepy, it's when I look at a Google map, I really don't want to see all the names of everyone I've visited in Manhattan show up. That seems to me a little weird and edgy, but do you agree with me that Google at its core is a little, not less mercenary? There is a difference there, right?
I do believe they're different, but I think what we're having, this conversation here is about, what the soul or the character of these leaders is really a proxy for a conversation about monarchy or democracy. Let me explain why that is. If you are going to allow these huge monopolies to exist that have almost as much power as government, it's a little the way, and then it all depends on whether you have a good king or a bad king, or a good leader or a bad leader. And it's a little bit the way, monarchical style of government is. And when you had a great king, it was the best possible. But when you had the terrible, insane king or malicious tyrant, it was the worst possible. And kind of the idea of the American constitutional structure is we don't fully trust anyone. We want them to be good, but we have they only get to be there for 4 or 8 years, whatever. You have a lot of checks and balances. So if you have some insane maniac, become a congressman or whatever, that they're out of there for a while. Now, sometimes it's very inefficient and bad and so forth, but that's the same way competition is. Competition can often be really bad. The best of all possible systems for a lot of market is kind of like an enlightened monopolist. And maybe Google at its best has been like that. I mean, they make some pretty good products, right? And they haven't, they do some creepy stuff, but they haven't, taken advertising money. Well, they've probably taken Russian advertising money, but they have not been as bad. But the problem is, what happens when this generation ages out, or what happens if they get older and a little bit? You're still betting on single individuals and their character pretty hard. And I think that's kind of what antitrust law is trying to resist. It's a system where we just have to have the so much power concentrated in one guy.
Mm-hmm. So I gather. One other thing I wanted to ask you about. What's that?
Well, I add to that. I also think often the founding generation of a tech company, or even any company, is a little more ideal. They do it for other reasons, and then time passes on. You have another generation of leaders, more and more and more mercenary.
Yeah,
bottom line thinking.
Well, yeah, and in fact, you've seen departures from Facebook by heads of companies that Facebook bought because they thought Facebook was turning their company into a commodity. So the guy left both Instagram and WhatsApp. Their leaders have left, and neither of them seems to have been terribly happy with what had happened. I don't think Zuckerberg violated a pledge to them. I think he said, we'll give you a few years before we really start doing anything to speak of, and then they started doing it, and the guys left. But you see that.
I think you'd have to ask them. That's part of my argument for the breakup. Is these guys are complaining about doing things they don't want to do, it's possible they want to do things that would be competitive with Facebook. Mm-hmm. And not being we don't want to have higher quality, we don't want to have so many ads or something like that. Mm-hmm. And they're well, wait, that'll take things away from the mothership, or who knows what. But it fortifies my argument they should be separate companies.
Yeah, and like, what is the argument for it being costly or risky to break them up? I mean, that's what I don't get. I mean, you may or may not be right that the continued agglomeration of them leads to bad things, but there's obviously a significant chance of it. And like, what's the downside of them being separate entities? What's the consumer harm in that? It's very hard to imagine. I don't see any magical synergy among them when they're under Facebook's umbrella that's doing me any good.
Yeah, I mean, if I were them, I don't work for them, they would probably say something like, oh, we've synchronized our ad buying networks or something, or we have a seamless, but I don't think they've got anything. I'm saying you could hire an economist to find something, and but I don't think they got anything. That's one of the reasons I think it's a good case. Is it's not, if you said, okay, I want to break Google into three pieces, maybe it's a good argument, just straight three Googles that are competing. But you might say, it might not work as well, or it might sort of just break the whole thing and people would hate it. It might be good. I don't know, but it's at least that you have to argue with it.
Yeah.
I don't see the other case. I'm like you.
Yeah, I guess you're right. They might say slightly lower ad costs, but it's like, who cares? I mean, compared to possibly catastrophic effect on governance and society, I'd take the risk of slightly higher prices for advertisers. Do you know how you would break Google up?
In theory, the prices would be lower for advertisers.
If they broke it up?
Yeah, because they'd be competing for advertisers.
You would think.
So their argument would be more like, oh no, there's efficiencies in our, we all work together, we share the same HR offices, and we buy office supplies from the same place, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So you mentioned breaking Google into three parts. Do you have a scheme in mind, like how you would break up Google? What parts?
I haven't got that one together. One thing is you might with Google, you might go more vertically. So for example, you might, you might break off YouTube, for example, or or the shopping network or things like that, like these kind of associated companies. Mm-hmm. It's not really clear that they would even survive as separate companies, but maybe that's the problem. I think that's it. I think it takes a lot more thinking about what you would do. You could also geographically break up Google. This is more of a European thing. You could have a Google Europe, even a Google Germany, Google France. You could all have a separate, so they're separate by country. Mm-hmm. It's not clear the efficiencies of having one search engine are necessary. You could also just try breaking Google in two and see what happened. Mm-hmm. Well, I realize but you broke AT&T into 8 pieces, and I think it sort of stimulated things. Google in 2, Google Red and Google Blue, and Google would say that would make us a much less efficient company, would hurt people, but they might actually be directly fighting with each other, more innovative.
So you mean actually split it down the middle, so to speak, and give them both possession of the intellectual property?
Yeah, something like that.
That would be interesting.
Then they could try to differentiate from there. Mm-hmm. We broke up NBC in the 50s, I believe.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, there was NBC Blue and Red. They were the same.
What became of them? I mean, ABC. What?
ABC.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I had no idea. That's in your book, The Master Switch, presumably.
Yeah, it used to just be CBS and NBC, and then broke off ABC, and gave them whatever. For a long time, ABC was kind of the loser, but eventually they came back. I think the numbers matter. I think you see different things when there's 1, when there's 2, when there's 3, when there's 4. It all changes in pretty important ways.
Now, what about Amazon? It seems like it's, 2 things. I'd say, like, as a consumer, so far, I really have no complaints. The prices seem as cheap as I could hope for and so on. It does seem kind of unfair the way they it isn't just that they buy up small companies, is that sometimes they use their weight to put those companies under pressure, right? Like there was some diapers company or something. So they basically render them non-viable and say, okay, we're offering to buy you for like $3, and the people have no alternative, and they sell. That's actually happened, right? Yeah.
I think Amazon does good things and does bad things. So the good things Amazon does, I think, is sometimes encourage competition. Sometimes you buy something you never heard of because you found it on Amazon, I don't know, or you find some book. The original purpose is you find like one of your classic books, and maybe it would be in a bookstore, but who knows, right? You find these things and you buy them. So that stuff Amazon is good for. I also like when Amazon tries to challenge industries that thinks are no good. I think it's trying to get into healthcare or health insurance or something.
Mm-hmm.
And those guys could need a wake-up call. So that's like good Amazon. Bad Amazon, I think, is what you're talking about. So one thing, I don't like it when they copy some of the most successful products that are on their platform. I think that's a problem. Also, I think when they start in serious ways discriminating in how they treat different companies of the same products, when they got involved in this whole book battles, and suddenly, like, I can't remember which book seller was banned, but also when you couldn't buy those books, you start to realize, they have this effect on speech, kind of net neutrality type issues, where it's like, wait, hold on a second.
I just noticed that the Kindle version of my latest book costs more than the paperback. Now, something weird is going on here, right? And I got to think the answer is it's monopoly power over the price of the Kindle. I mean, it cost them like a penny to create that copy of it, and right? What's going on?
Well, I don't know what's going on in your instance. I do know they have close to monopoly power over the Kindle.
Yeah.
What they're doing with that. I mean, the funny part, though, here you start to get this complicated things because publishers have wanted the prices to be higher. Amazon wants them lower, so it's a pretty complicated story. But yeah, I think that they are growing in power. They have some, they've almost got 50% of retail. If you look at their main competitors, the big box online, I think they're approaching monopoly status in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing with Amazon, I've got to watch what they do. They start raising. So right now, their whole strategy has been like cheap dominance.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, does Prime membership suddenly go from 100? What is it now? 115, 200, 500? They start doubling.
Yeah.
They're showing this ability to raise Prime membership at rates which seem unusual.
Yeah, where else are you going to go?
Right, and well, that's the point. And if then I think you get much more serious about what's going on here. If they show an obvious ability to raise prices just at will.
I mean, I got to give Bezos credit. He seems to me in some ways the most ingenious of all of these. The way they have used the different businesses they've gotten into from what started out as an online book selling store, like the Alexa thing. They saw that first and they weren't even in that line of work basically. Right.
No, I agree. I think he is more talented than people thought, because for years he was losing money. In some ways, his business model isn't as fancy. Facebook and Google have these weird business models, very, very geeky.
Mm-hmm.
These strange advertising, everything is free. And the fact is, all the companies have tried to do a lot of things. It's just that they tend to fail more often. Like Facebook launched a phone at one point.
Yeah,
Google has launched a million projects.
Well, Amazon tried a phone that didn't work. Yeah.
Okay. But, a lot of people have tried to go on a lot of things, and Amazon just succeeded more in them. So yeah, I give them a lot of credit for that. And, like I said, sometimes they really make competition possible. I think we got to watch and make sure if they are going to dominate retail. Well, first of all, should we let them dominate retail? If they dominate, they shouldn't be allowed to buy anybody else, online retailers. Like no Amazon buying Target or Amazon buying Walmart or something. That would be a catastrophe. And then you got to watch how they run that platform. I think they also deceive people in their searches. So when you search for something, the results are really weird. And you expect to get, say, the cheapest or the best product. Half the time you get their product. They search sponsor now. Yeah. But then you're not always really clear if you're getting, why you're getting the product you're getting. It's not always the cheapest. Sometimes you have to search through 10 layers before you get the one you really want.
Yeah.
I think they're a bit funky with all this.
Sometimes the top couple are explicitly ads, right?
Right, exactly. They've gotten more into the advertising business, actually, on the side.
Yeah.
But in a way that's, even at a point where you want to be able to trust them to give you the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, Europe is more aggressive. In fact, I think Europe just did something that's going to make it easier for handset makers like Samsung to go into things other than Android if they want, if I understand it correctly. But in any event, is that roughly right? Or
roughly, yeah, the Android case, yeah.
And they're more aggressive. So, talk about why that is and what the implications are for the ability of the U.S. to get more aggressive. I mean, why the difference?
I think they're aggressive for a number of reasons. They've been less influenced by the Bork Chicago culture that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. Not uninfluenced, but less influenced. they have, they're generally people are more favorable towards government in Europe than here in the United States. Now, in some ways, I think America traditionally was more aggressive in one way. America has traditionally been much more about the big breakup. Like the big cases I'm talking about, that's an American tradition. Mm-hmm. Europe is much more into, we don't like what you're doing, we're going to regulate you and fine you and so forth. I think Europe should go more for the breakups. I'm into structural remedies myself. I don't like long-standing oversight. For the reasons you said, I think it gets government involved, and sometimes they just aren't good remedies. When Europe went after Amazon, Microsoft, their big remedy was, we're going to have this real player. I can't even explain it, but Windows Media is not going to be bundled with Windows, and nobody knew what it did, didn't do anything. So they sometimes have bad remedies. But overall, they have a culture where they're more suspicious. Now, some people think it's because, well, these are American companies and Europe wants to punish them. That might be. I'm not going to say it's nothing. But I think overall it's just a much more powerful and pro-business kind of sentiment over here.
Mm-hmm. And
they care more about privacy also. Sorry to add that in.
That's a big theme in Europe.
Yeah.
And that sometimes benefits us, right? Because don't the companies sometimes just creating global policies that are cool with Europe?
They do. That's right. Although sometimes they just have a European version of things and an American version.
Like the right to be, what is it, the right to be forgotten or something? Like you can force Google can you force Google in Europe to remove links to super unflattering information about you?
You can petition for that, yes, and then they have to do it.
I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind.
Actually, I wouldn't mind that either. You ask most Americans, they're like, actually, that sounds pretty good.
I can definitely think of a couple of pieces I'd like to. Some of them written by me, some of them mentioning me. But so how optimistic are you then? I mean, I guess maybe the good news, you tell me, is it are we at least at a stage where what is inhibiting progress, what you would consider progress on this front, is kind of old-fashioned corporate lobbying? At least like the Silicon Valley companies haven't used their power over our brains via like social media and search and so on to start it hasn't gotten to that point. I think we should get assertive before it gets to that point. But I guess the good news is this is like old-fashioned lobbying that's getting in the way.
Yeah, it's lobbying. It's also a generation of and a cultural thing. I think so the Republican Party, it's more like, we're generally in favor of big business. Now, there are Republicans now, though, who are starting to get pro-antitrust as well. On the Democratic side, it's a little more complicated. Sort of this excessively, I think, technocratic, absolute faith and sort of economists can figure it all out, coupled with the fact that, I think the antitrust establishment has kind of become financially attached to this model. There's a lot of big law firms that are attached to this, the way things are. So it's just this big mess. And in my view, is not only about lobbying, because frankly, it's not Congress that's involved. It's courts, agencies. It's more of an ideological generational shift. But I think things are changing. And I hope it's delayed before we're all mind controlled by Alexa or Siri or whatever.
That's what I'm hoping. It is an odd feature how big. I mean, it seemed odd to me when they broke up AT&T. I thought, so like this one judge did all this? The reliance on the judicial process, like suppose it had been another judge, wouldn't have happened, right?
That is possible. It is very 19th century in its style. But there's a tradition to it, and a lot of important American things rely on judges. How's that?
Okay. I mean, you could have legislation where Congress would reassert control, but for now, you're right. It's not so much about lobbying because it's largely done to some extent via executive branch policy, but also in the courts.
There's a lot of pressure. To too hard or not. When they always have hearings, what are you doing? Blah 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 blah. So there's some pressure. But I think things are building. Honestly, I think there's a movement now. I think, you look at a lot of the people running for election in 2020. Cory Booker, for example, just random. I was watching Cory Booker give a talk, and, he's talking about we've let things go too far, and, the antitrust law has fallen into disrepair. Elizabeth Warren's been saying that for a long time. So I do think this has become part of essentially the progressive and even the Democratic agenda, and it has also got a following on in the Republican Party, especially on the tech stuff. Maybe for whatever reasons. I mean, there is a Republican tradition that also believes in competition. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. Even Nixon's the guy who started the AT&T case. Signs of a comeback. There's Republicans who also don't like big business.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying probably majority like it, but there's also a revival on the right.
Okay. Now, just to make sure I understand you, because when you said you said there's a lot of pressure, and then there was a little bit of a glitch in the audio, but you mean there are politicians who are bringing pressure to bear? That was your point? Yeah.
I think there's a movement.
Okay. Okay. Good. Well, anything else you want to say? It's really a good time. It's like an important book, an important conversation. I think it'll get a lot of attention. This is my prediction. There's a lot of wariness of all this stuff, right?
I mean, look, I go back to the basics. I think that some of this comes to what kind of country you want to live in, and questions of what it means to be free and what kind of democracy this is. And I think we've been ignoring the role of economic power in that equation.
Yeah.
Even though that's the thing that affects you day to day so much. It's like I said, that nurse in the town with a hospital monopoly looking for a job,
yeah.
or the currency trade. I think these things really matter to people. Antitrust law is a traditional solution. The only thing I didn't mention is Louis Brandeis. He's kind of the star of this book.
Oh, right. You want a neo-Brandeisian paradigm. So what was his emphasis when he was on the Supreme Court?
Actually, his most important work was before he was on the Supreme Court.
Okay.
I think it was in the 1912 election when he was Woodrow Wilson's chief economic advisor. And, he was basically antitrust. He was, he had basically the idea that the United States it works better as a nation that has a competitive economy, has a lot of small businesses, room for entrepreneurship, where people feel like they're masters of their economic destiny. One of the things I think is so interesting about Brandeis is he thought this really profoundly affected the character of us, living in this republic. And he thought when businesses are a little smaller, when you have room for entrepreneurship, you have a more Republican, not in the political sense, but a more sort of self-formed citizenry. And I think we kind of lose that sometimes. When you work as an employee and your whole life is defined by the employment policies, you really do lose something. And when we're all just kind of cogs in a wheel and cogs in a machine, something is lost that was the American spirit. So that I think is something I'm also trying to resurrect in this book, is a reattention to the Brandeisian ideas of virtue and character in an economic sense.
So to some extent, to foster entrepreneurship.
Yeah, entrepreneurship, but also just a sense of economic self-determination. I can switch jobs.
Mm-hmm.
I can, just as one example, am I free to switch jobs, or do I feel like, oh my God, I'm just trapped here?
Right. There's only one Google. Right. Yeah. Okay. Well,
even small things like, I need to, do you feel powerless? In front of, just say, the airlines, even in your day to day, or the pharmaceutical industry, do they jack their prices and I just take it, or do something outrageous? I think these more than people realize determine what it means to live in our society.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And of course, then there are also the industries where there's a bunch of different brands, but it turns out there's only two companies that own them all, like rental cars.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like there's nine rental cars counters and two, maybe three companies. Okay, so this is what it looked like, except be smaller. The Curse of Bigness, Antitrust, New Gilded Age. Maybe it will become so important that the net neutrality thing will be relegated to the second paragraph of your obituary. That would be a good outcome.
I don't know how we ended up talking about my death, but that's
I'm sorry. It's me. I'm not like the most cheerful.
I know. That's what everyone next to you.
But let's just hope that there will be lots of different information providers and lots of different obituaries. Let 1,000 obituaries bloom in a world with vigilant antitrust enforcement. Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Tim.
Thank you.
See ya.
Wait, can I ask you